I never thought I'd end up writing something like this on here. Feels weird, like I'm trying to turn my life into one of those posts you skim at 2 a.m. and forget about. But I've been carrying this around for years, and honestly, I don't really know where else to put it anymore. So here goes. My name's William. Back then, I was broke in a way that eats into your thinking. Not, can't afford a vacation. Broke, more like. Choosing between rent and food and hoping your bank app doesn't refresh too quickly. Broke. I had a background in finance, nothing impressive, just enough to understand how money moves when nobody's looking closely. That's when I first came across what I can only call the secret investor situation. It started with an email that looked like junk. No name, no company header, just a bland subject line about alternative funding channels. I almost deleted it. But I didn't. Something about it felt intentional. Like it wasn't trying to convince me, just testing if I'd even notice it was there. The pitch was simple, almost insultingly so: large amounts of capital, available for movement through intermediaries, no identity attached to the source. No face behind the money. No questions asked, at least not on paper. I should have walked away immediately. I know that now. But at the time, I remember thinking something stupidly rational like, if the money has no owner, does it even have rules? That thought stuck. I didn't reply right away. I didn't even plan anything yet. I just sat on it, reread it a few times over the next couple of days, telling myself I was just curious. Like that made it harmless. It didn't feel like the beginning of anything criminal. It felt like standing in front of a door that was already half open and just deciding whether I should push it a little wider. And I did. That's the part one can't really unmake. After that first email, I kept pretending it didn't matter. I even tried to be disciplined about it. I'd open my inbox, see it sitting there, and tell myself, normal people delete things like this and move on. But I didn't delete it. Instead, I started doing what I always did when something financial didn't make sense. I broke it down. I checked the phrasing, the routing style, the metadata patterns. It wasn't sloppy. Whoever sent it understood how to avoid obvious flags. That alone made it more interesting than it should have been. A second message came 3 days later. Same tone, same anonymity, but with more specifics, not about the money itself, but about intermediary structuring opportunities. It wasn't direct. It was careful. Almost respectful in a strange way. That's when I started building scenarios in my head. Not actions yet, just possibilities. Like if this were a simulation I was running for someone else. I told myself I was just analyzing risk. That I wasn't involved. But I started checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit. I didn't plan to respond. That's the part one always tell myself, like it softens what came next. But one night, around 2 a.m., I was still awake, scrolling through the same email thread like an idiot looking for a different outcome. I typed a reply. Deleted it. Typed again. Eventually I sent something vague, not agreement, not refusal. Just a question framed like skepticism. What exactly is the structure you're referring to? I thought that would end it. Most scams or shady setups fall apart the moment you ask for clarity. Instead, I got an answer in under 10 minutes. Still no name. Still no identity. Just instructions on how capital flow insulation worked in their system, layered transfers, indirect exposure, timing gaps. It was written like someone who had done this many times before. That should have scared me off. But what stuck with me wasn't the illegality. It was the precision. It felt organized. Almost corporate. And worse, it felt real. That was the moment I stopped being just a curious observer and became something else, even if I didn't admit it yet. After that exchange, things escalated in a way that still feels too smooth in hindsight. No pressure, no threats, no urgency. Just structure. Like I had been handed a manual, and was free to close it at any time. They outlined conditions, but never in legal language. More like guidelines, when to move information, how to route decisions, what to avoid mentioning in writing. Everything was designed to keep distance between me and the source. I told myself I was just reading it. Not agreeing. Not committing. But I started organizing notes anyway. Separate file. Offline. I even gave it a neutral name like it was a project for work. That's how it starts, by the way, not with action, but with labeling something as manageable. The money itself wasn't visible yet. Just references to it. Large, vague numbers that didn't feel real enough to trigger instinctive fear. And still, I remember thinking, if no one can trace the origin, then what exactly is the crime? I wasn't asking because I wanted an answer. I was asking because I was already leaning toward one. The first time actual money appeared, it didn't arrive like in movies. No dramatic notification, no flashing numbers. It was subtle, a shift in account metadata, a pending structure flagged as internal test liquidity. That's what they called it. Test. I remember staring at it for a long time, waiting for something to feel different. It didn't. That was the most unsettling part. There were instructions attached, still written in that calm, almost polite tone. Move it, observe timing, report back anomalies. Like I was running diagnostics, not participating in anything questionable. I told myself I wasn't handling anything illegal. I wasn't the source. I wasn't even the destination. I was just, in between. That word started showing up everywhere in my thinking, in between. The transfer went through without issues. No alarms. No interruptions. No consequences. And instead of relief, I felt something worse, validation. Because now it wasn't theory anymore. It worked. And once something works, your brain stops asking whether it should. After the first transfer, everything started to normalize in a way that still bothers me when I think back on it. The second one didn't feel like a step deeper. It felt like repetition. Same structure, slightly different timing, slightly larger amount. Still framed as movement testing. I remember catching myself checking the system with less hesitation. Less emotional noise. That was the real shift, not the money, but the ease. There was no celebration, no sense of accomplishment. Just procedure. I would log in, follow the instructions, document the outcome, log out. The secret investor, if I can even call it that, never appeared. No voice, no identity. Only messages that arrived like clockwork, always stripped of anything personal. At some point I realized I had stopped asking why and started focusing entirely on how efficiently. That should have been a warning sign. Instead, I told myself I was adapting. Acting professionally. Staying detached. But detachment and dissociation can look identical from the inside, and I didn't know which one I was actually practicing anymore. It didn't fall apart. It just shifted. There was a delay in one of the transfers. Nothing dramatic, just a lag that wasn't supposed to happen in there. Clean timing model. I remember staring at the screen longer than necessary, waiting for the system to correct itself. It did eventually. But the message that followed wasn't as calm as usual. Still no name, but the tone changed. Slightly sharper. Less conversational. It asked for confirmation of compliance consistency. That phrase stuck with me more than it should have. I started replaying everything I'd done so far. Not because I thought I'd made a mistake, but because I wanted to make sure I hadn't missed something I wasn't supposed to see. That's when the unease crept in, not fear, exactly. More like awareness that there was a structure underneath all of this I still didn't understand. For the first time, I stopped feeling like a participant. And started wondering if I was just a tool that hadn't been told what it was being used for yet. I didn't change my environment, but it started feeling different. That's the only way I can describe it. I'd sit in the same apartment, same chair, same low light from the desk lamp, and work through these instructions, like it was just another task. But the silence around me got heavier. Not loud silence, The kind you only notice when you realize you've been holding your breath without meaning to. There were more transfers now, more frequent. Still labeled as tests, still framed as harmless. But the scale was no longer something I could ignore internally. I started compartmentalizing without thinking about it. One part of my mind handled execution. Another part monitored risk. A third part, the one I didn't like acknowledging, just waited to see what would happen next. No one checked on me. No one asked questions. That absence of oversight was part of what made it feel unreal. But unreal things can still have consequences. I just hadn't seen any of mine yet, and that was starting to feel like its own kind of warning. It wasn't law enforcement. Not at first. It was a bank compliance notice, formal, polite, almost boring in tone. A request for clarification regarding transaction patterns consistent with intermediary structuring behavior. I remember reading it twice. The first time as information. The second time as threat. Nothing was frozen. Nothing was blocked. But the fact that someone outside the system had started noticing changed everything. I was instructed, by the same anonymous source, to pause activity temporarily. The message called it a cooling interval. Like I was part of a machine that just needed to idle for a while. That's when the anxiety finally showed up in a clear form. Not abstract unease anymore, but physical awareness. Sleeplessness. Constant checking. Rereading old messages like they might have hidden meanings I missed. The most disturbing part wasn't the notice itself. It was how quickly I adapted to the idea of pausing, like I had done this kind of thing before and just needed to reset. That was the moment I realized I wasn't fully in control of the rhythm anymore. The cooling interval wasn't actually quiet. Messages still came, just less frequently, and in a different tone. More fragmented. Less instructional, more observational. It felt like I was being watched through the absence of direct contact. I tried to step back mentally. Go through normal routines. Eat properly, sleep at normal hours, convince myself I had just stumbled into something that would fade out on its own. But my thoughts didn't settle. Every notification felt heavier than it should have. Even unrelated emails made my chest tighten for a second before I realized they weren't from them. That's when I started noticing something else. I wasn't just afraid of getting caught. I was afraid of the structure collapsing while I was still inside it. Because I didn't actually understand where I stood anymore. I wasn't the origin. I wasn't the endpoint. I wasn't even sure I was still an operator. I was just positioned somewhere in a chain I couldn't see. And once you realize that, silence stops feeling like relief. It starts feeling like the system is waiting for you to make the next mistake. The next message didn't come through the usual channel. It showed up in a place I hadn't associated with any of this, a secondary account I barely used. That alone made my stomach drop. Not because it was hacked in an obvious way, but because it implied they had mapped more of me than I was comfortable admitting existed. The message itself was short. Almost casual. It said the structure required one final stabilization phase. That wording bothered me more than anything else so far. Final. Not. Next. Not. Continued. Final. There were instructions again, but different this time. More physical world-oriented. Less abstract routing, more concrete coordination. That shift made everything feel closer, less like a system and more like something that could reach into daily life. I remember sitting there, not moving, just reading it over and over. I didn't agree immediately. I didn't refuse either. I just stayed in that in-between state again, the one I had been living in for too long, telling myself I needed more time to think. But deep down, I already knew time wasn't really a factor anymore. This was the first time I felt actual fear instead of just tension. Not fear of getting caught in some abstract legal sense. Fear of being located. Not my actions, me. The instructions required coordination with someone in person. A courier-type role, though it was never called that directly. Just handover verification. Neutral phrasing, like everything else. I tried to rationalize it. People do intermediaries all the time in legitimate systems. Logistics, consulting, escrow structures. I told myself I was just another invisible layer in something normal. But I knew that wasn't true anymore. I remember standing by my window, reading the message again and again, noticing how my reflection looked slightly detached from me, like I was watching someone else hesitate. For the first time, I seriously considered stopping. Not because I thought I could undo what had already happened. I knew that part was gone. But because continuing meant stepping out of abstraction and into proximity. And proximity is where consequences stop being theoretical. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just worried about the system anymore. I was worried about what the system might ask me to become next. I agreed to the handover verification, but I still told myself I had control over how far it would go. That illusion didn't last long. The location was ordinary. That's what unsettled me most, a public space where nothing looked suspicious on the surface. People passing by, normal conversations, nobody aware that anything unusual was happening. The instructions were precise, almost unnecessarily so. Timing, positioning, brief visual confirmation. No names involved. No direct exchange of anything obvious. I kept expecting something to go wrong, a signal that would make it stop. But nothing did. The person I was meant to observe didn't stand out. That was the point, I realized later. Not secrecy through hiding, but secrecy through normality. When it was over, there was no follow-up conversation. Just a single acknowledgement that it had been completed. Walking away from that place, I remember feeling strangely disconnected from my own body, like I had crossed a boundary that didn't announce itself while I was crossing it. And the worst part was how quickly my mind tried to normalize it afterward, like it was just another task I had finished correctly. After the handover, things didn't explode. They tightened. That's the only way I can describe it. Like a net slowly contracting instead of snapping. There were fewer messages, but each one felt heavier. More final, more deliberate. The structure I had been moving inside started to feel less like a system and more like a perimeter. I noticed small things first, inconsistencies in timing, delays that didn't match the previous precision. Then larger ones, references to risk exposure recalibration, trace minimization protocols. Phrases that sounded clinical but carried an obvious undertone of urgency. I tried to pull back mentally again, to re-establish distance, but I realized I didn't have a clean exit point anymore. There wasn't a moment where I could say, this is where I stop and walk away unchanged. Because I wasn't unchanged. And I think that's when the emotional part finally caught up to the logical part. Not panic, not relief, just a steady recognition that whatever this was, it had already left an imprint that couldn't be undone by simply stepping back. It wasn't about continuing anymore. It was about what had already been set in motion without me fully realizing it. I don't talk about this in real life. Not because I think it makes me sound dangerous, but because most people assume stories like this have clear endings. Arrest, exposure, collapse, something neat you can point to and say that's where it stopped. That's not what happened. There was no dramatic resolution. No final confrontation that tied everything together. It just dissolved. Communication stopped. The structure I had been interacting with went quiet in a way that felt intentional, not accidental. Like a system shutting doors one by one until there's nothing left to respond to. I never found out who the secret investor actually was. I still don't know if it was one person, a group, or something more distributed than that. What I do know is what it did to me, not in a cinematic way, but in a slow, internal one. It changed how I interpret silence, opportunity, and control. I'm more cautious now, but not in a clean, lesson learned way. More like I carry awareness of how easily boundaries can shift when you're tired, desperate, and curious at the same time. If there's any advice buried in this, it's simple. Ambiguity is not safety. Sometimes it's just delay before consequence.